Blair Thorne had driven herself to the appointment because the letter said to come alone, and because whatever waited at the end of the Nicola Valley Road might be the last thing standing between Northgate Diagnostics and a collapse she had been quietly managing for 11 months. The letter had arrived on a Thursday, sealed in heavy cream stock, stamped with a notary's crest she didn't recognize. It named her as the commercial representative of the Grail estate and gave her an address outside Merritt, British Columbia, a place she'd never been, and a time of 5:30 in the afternoon that allowed almost no margin for the drive from Kamloops Airport. It warned that if she failed to appear, the licensing rights to a medical diagnostic platform called Clarity Core would transfer automatically to another designated party, and she already knew which name that designation would carry. Maxwell Crew had been waiting for an opening like this for 2 years. She had taken the Coquihalla as far as it served her, then turned south onto a narrower road where the aspen stands were already going gold, and the afternoon light came at a low amber slant across the valley. The rental sedan handled the pavement smoothly, and she was making good time until the first serious curve past a logging cut block, where the dashboard flickered once, the steering stiffened, and the car coasted to a stop on the gravel shoulder, as though it had simply decided it had gone far enough. Blair sat in the sudden quiet and tried the ignition 3 times. Nothing. Not even the click of a dead battery, just silence and the faint smell of dry grass through the vents. She stepped out into the cool October air, opened the hood out of habit rather than any real expectation, and stared at an engine that looked entirely normal and entirely useless. Her phone showed a single bar that vanished the moment she tried to use it. She stood on the shoulder in her gray wool coat and felt the particular helplessness of a person who could run a board meeting but could not make a car start. The truck appeared around the bend 5 minutes later, a dark green F-150, older than anything she'd seen in a company parking lot, its bed carrying a steel-fabricated toolbox and a coil of orange safety cones. It slowed without her flagging it down and pulled onto the shoulder behind her, and the man who climbed out moved with an unhurried ease that she found faintly irritating, given how precisely every minute now mattered. He introduced himself as Hugh. He said he could take a look if she liked, and before she answered he was already at the open hood, his canvas work jacket creased at the elbows and carrying a faint smell of machine oil and pine pitch. He said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said the failure didn't look mechanical. More like an interruption to the electronic control module, a clean one, too clean for ordinary wear. Blair almost told him that a late-model rental wasn't something a roadside mechanic would be able to read accurately. She stopped herself because there was something in the way he said it, quiet, precise, without any performance to it, that made her want to hear the rest. He confirmed, still looking at the engine, that the car couldn't be repaired here. Whatever had interrupted the control module had done so in a way that required a shop, and probably a specific kind of shop. He straightened and asked where she needed to be. She told him it was urgent, without saying more. He checked his watch and said he was already running behind himself, but could take her as far as the Merritt turnoff if that helped. He said it with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who didn't frame the offer as a favor. Blair climbed into the passenger seat of the F-150 and tucked her coat around her knees. She told herself she would not catalog the details of someone else's truck. She cataloged them anyway. A child's drawings were folded and wedged above the sun visor, their edges gone soft from being opened and refolded many times. A stainless thermos in the cup holder. A small round sticker on the glove box that read "World's Okayest Dad" in the cheerful uneven font of something chosen at a dollar store by someone who was not Hugh himself. She understood without asking that he was raising a child alone, and some instinct she hadn't been expecting kept her from treating that as background detail. For the first few minutes they said nothing useful to each other. She checked her watch twice. The road curved south through stands of lodgepole pine, and Hugh held the truck to a pace she found unreasonably cautious, given the conditions, which were not that bad. She offered him, with the careful casualness she used when she needed something from someone she outranked, a sum of money that made his expression shift almost imperceptibly. He said the road was slick in patches, and no appointment was worth a rollover, and said it the way he might have said an engine needed a new filter, without heat, without apology. She said, more sharply than she'd intended, that he probably couldn't appreciate what it meant to have hundreds of people depending on whether she arrived somewhere on time. He said, after a pause that felt considered rather than slow, that he'd found responsibility didn't usually weigh more, just because the numbers attached to it were larger. She didn't answer that. It landed in a way she filed away without examining. They were climbing the long ridge past Dot Creek when Hugh said something about the redundant fail-safe architecture in the Clarity diagnostic platform. Not directed at her, more the tail end of a thought he'd apparently been turning over. He used the specific correct terminology for a proprietary system she knew intimately because her company had been quietly trying to license it for 2 years. Blair turned and looked at him directly for the first time. She asked where a contractor picked up that kind of technical knowledge. He said, without looking away from the road, that he'd worked in a different area for a long time before things changed direction. He said it the way people say things they don't intend to explain further. Her phone caught a bar at the top of the ridge. A message from Spencer Greer, Northgate's chief operating officer, told her in the terse shorthand he used for bad news that Maxwell Crew had already arrived at the estate and was asking questions the estate's solicitor was refusing to answer. Spencer urged her to sign whatever Crew proposed rather than risk him walking away from the financing arrangement entirely. Blair read the message twice and put the phone face down on her knee. She asked Hugh, partly to stop reading the message again, where exactly he was headed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a sealed envelope, cream-colored stock. An embossed notary's crest along the bottom edge that she recognized before she finished reaching for it. He handed it across, and she read the address aloud, her voice going flat somewhere in the middle of the street number. He asked her to say it again. She did. He eased his foot off the accelerator and let the truck roll slowly to the shoulder, and he sat for a moment, looking at the road ahead before he asked to see her letter. They sat on the gravel shoulder of the Nicola Valley Highway in the late afternoon, and held matching letters from a dead man who had apparently arranged for both of them to be in the same place at the same hour. The notary seals matched. The verification codes matched. The time and date matched. The only difference was the designation printed beneath each name. Hers read Commercial Representative of the Estate, and his read Technical Guardian, a designation she had never once seen in decades of contract work. Blair's first clear thought was that Hugh Merritt had been placed along her route by Maxwell Crew to delay her or gather information. She looked at him with that thought fully formed and watched to see if he flinched. He didn't. He handed her his letter and let her examine it for as long as she needed, without speaking, without defending himself against an accusation she hadn't made aloud. When she gave it back, he said only that Edwin Grail had once been his employer, that he hadn't spoken to the estate in 7 years, and that he wanted to understand why. The name Edwin Grail moved through Blair's memory like a key turning in a door. Edwin Grail, founder of Verdant Medical Systems, the Vancouver company that had collapsed 7 years ago after a catastrophic failure in their Clarity diagnostic platform. She tried to recall the name of the engineer who had been blamed for it and couldn't, and she looked at the man beside her and began, slowly and uncomfortably, to understand what she was looking at. Hugh said, reading what was forming in her expression, that he hadn't come for her company and didn't want anything from Northgate Diagnostics. He'd come because Edwin Grail had owed him the truth for 7 years, and he wanted to know whether it was finally going to arrive. Something in the steadiness of his voice made her believe him, and she told herself she could reassess later if the evidence required it. She said they should keep driving. The iron gates of the Grail estate came into view as the light went low and gold over the valley. Flanked by 3 vehicles, Blair recognized as belonging to Maxwell Crew's security detail. Hugh guided the old F-150 through the gates and parked it among the black SUVs with the particular unself-consciousness of someone who had long since stopped caring what his truck said about him to people who judged by trucks. A member of the estate's security staff moved toward Hugh before his door was fully open, looking past him at the toolbox in the bed and already forming an assumption. Blair stepped down from the passenger side, and the same guard adjusted immediately, addressing her by her full name and title with practiced smoothness. Maxwell Crew appeared on the front steps, tall, silver-haired, every element of his presentation calibrated to suggest authority without effort. He remarked, loudly enough to be overheard by several people standing nearby, that he was surprised at the mode of transport Blair had arranged for the occasion. He then turned to Hugh and extracted a folded pair of 50s from his coat pocket and pressed them toward him with the particular generosity of a man who is performing it rather than feeling it, and suggested Hugh park around the side with the service vehicles. Hugh looked at the money without touching it. He said he had been invited to the meeting. Crew smiled the way powerful men smile at things they find contemptibly small, and suggested to Blair, in the tone of someone managing an awkward situation with patience, that Hugh was likely attempting to exploit her generosity by inventing some connection to the estate. Blair said nothing. She told herself later that she hadn't had enough information yet. What she knew, standing there, was that her silence in that moment sat wrong in a way she would not forget. Spencer Greer appeared at Crew's elbow, glanced at Hugh's face with something that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite the absence of it, and murmured into Crew's ear. Whatever Spencer said made a single flicker cross Crew's expression before it smoothed back into practiced calm. He instructed the security staff to escort Hugh off the property, citing the sensitivity of the proceedings about to take place inside. It was at that moment that the estate's front door opened and a woman in a charcoal blazer crossed the gravel with the unhurried authority of someone who knew exactly how much the next 10 seconds were going to cost the people who had misread the room. She introduced herself as Audrey Kells, solicitor for the Grail estate. She announced in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard that the proceedings required Hugh Merritt's presence, that his seat had been reserved specifically for him, and that the meeting could not and would not begin without him. Then she looked at Maxwell Crew and told him he would need to find another chair. The security staff stopped moving. Crew's smile did not recover itself. Inside the estate's library, dark-paneled and smelling faintly of old paper, Audrey Kells opened her folio and explained that Edwin Grail had recorded a statement before his death, and that it was to be played only when both designated parties were present together. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when people understand that what they are about to hear cannot be unknown afterward. Edwin Grail's voice came through a small speaker on the table, unhurried and slightly hoarse, the voice of a man choosing his words the way people choose them when they know there will be no second chance to say them differently. He said that the foundational architecture of Clarity Core, the entire diagnostic engine that Verdant Medical Systems had built its reputation on, and that had since been adapted into multiple platforms, including the one Northgate Diagnostics currently operated, had been designed by Hugh Merritt. He said that the catastrophic failure 7 years ago had not been caused by anything Hugh had built. The failure had been introduced by a modification made after Hugh's involvement ended. And Edwin had known this within 72 hours, and he had stayed silent because Maxwell Crew had told him plainly that defending Hugh would cost the company the investment keeping it alive. Hugh sat very still during the recording. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. The only visible change was a slight tightening at the line of his jaw, and Blair, watching him, thought about the 7 years that statement had arrived too late to undo. The will divided the guardianship of Clarity Corps in two. Hugh Merritt held the technical guardianship, sole authority over the platform's integrity and safety standards. Blair Thorne was named commercial guardian, responsible for bringing the technology properly to market. Neither party could authorize any license, sale, or deployment without the written agreement of the other. If they failed to reach an agreement by 10 o'clock the following morning, the technology would transfer into a nonprofit research trust for a full decade. Crew offered Hugh $3 million for the technical guardianship before the recording had fully finished. He said the number the way he said all numbers, as though the amount itself were an argument. Hugh said no without turning toward him, and the flatness of it unsettled Crew more than any counteroffer could have. Blair felt the panic move through her carefully maintained composure like a hairline crack in load-bearing glass. Northgate had 8 weeks of operating capital if Crew's financing held. 8 weeks became considerably shorter if it didn't. She pressed Hugh afterward, asking quietly whether he intended to use his guardianship to settle a grievance against a company that had never personally wronged him. He said he would only sign when Clarity Corps' safety had been verified without compromise. And when the truth of what had happened 7 years ago was recorded somewhere other than a dead man's private letter. It was not a negotiating position, it was a line. Audrey Kells placed a small brass key on the table between them. Edwin had built a sealed laboratory beneath the estate. Only both guardians together could open it. The room at the bottom of the narrow staircase behind a paneled wall was cool and dark, and smelled of dormant servers and undisturbed time. A working prototype of Clarity Corps sat at the center of a long workbench, connected to an offline system. Hugh typed the startup sequence from memory, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had written the language and had not forgotten a single character of it. Blair stood behind him and watched the screens come alive one by one, and understood for the first time with complete clarity that the man she had almost left on a gravel shoulder was not simply competent. He was the reason any of this existed at all. An hour into the diagnostic review, Hugh found it, a section of the core algorithm rewritten after his termination, trading diagnostic precision for processing speed in a way that reduced the failure rate to a number that looked acceptable on paper and would be devastating across any patient population of real size. Blair recognized it immediately, as the version Spencer Greer had been pushing her to greenlight. Citing competitive pressure and a testing timeline she had found slightly too aggressive, but had not yet overruled. They worked through the night. Blair pulled production data and regulatory frameworks, while Hugh traced every altered parameter back to its origin. They argued more than once, Blair pushing for speed, Hugh refusing every shortcut that touched patient safety, and somewhere past midnight they stopped arguing and started working in the same direction. Blair told him in a quieter hour that Northgate had 8 weeks. She had not told her board the actual number. Hugh was quiet for a moment, and then said that 7 years ago he had lost his career, his house, his professional standing, and his benefits in the same period he had lost his wife, and that he had rebuilt everything from whatever was left, and that the reason he had refused $3 million was not pride. It was that he would not allow the truth of what had happened to become another private transaction conducted in a room the people most affected by it would never be permitted to enter. Blair looked at the screen and said nothing for a long time. What Hugh found, buried 3 layers below anything a casual audit would have reached, was a set of modification approvals bearing Spencer Greer's unique authorization credentials. The timestamps placed Spencer inside the Verdant system during the exact window the algorithm had been altered. The blame had been rerouted afterward to an account registered under Hugh's own name. A signature Hugh recognized because he was the only person who had ever used that account, and he had not used it that night. They called Spencer down to the lab under the pretense of reviewing a financial discrepancy. He denied everything before Blair had finished the second sentence. Crew arrived minutes later, and between them they managed the room with the easy fluency of men who had done this before, framing the evidence as fabrication, framing Hugh's motive as obvious, framing Blair's role as that of a reasonable person who needed only to choose the simpler path. Spencer slid a prepared document across the table to Blair, a liability transfer placing every legal risk from any future Clarity failure onto Hugh Merritt personally. Blair picked it up and read the entire thing. She set it down without reaching for a pen. She crossed the room and stood beside Hugh Merritt, and she did not move back. Crew's expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with his face. He said that Crew Capital Partners would begin withdrawing every line of credit extended to Northgate Diagnostics at 9 o'clock the following morning. Blair said she understood. The lab's power failed 40 minutes later. Only the lab, only the servers, while the rest of the estate remained fully lit. Hugh examined the control panel behind an access plate and found a small signal device placed with the kind of precision that required familiarity with the building. The corridor camera had gone dark for 11 minutes, a window narrow enough to seem incidental and exact enough to feel deliberate. When the servers came back up, the external drive containing Spencer's authorization logs was gone. Blair stood in the dark of the lab and thought about her rental sedan on the Nicola Valley Road, about the clean silence with which it had died, about the words too clean for ordinary wear. Hugh pulled up the passive locator signal. He had built a backup transmitter into every sensitive drive he'd ever worked with, a habit from the Verdant years, when data had already been lost once on a project he'd trusted. The signal led them out of the estate and into the rear gravel lot to the wheel well of Maxwell Crew's own vehicle, parked between two birch trees at the edge of the property. Crew said immediately that someone had placed it there to implicate him. Hugh explained, without raising his voice, that the transmitter had been built into the drive before the estate meeting, before he had known any of these people would be in the same room as him, and that whoever had taken the drive had not known it was there. One file remained on the recovered drive, an audio recording 9 minutes long, time-stamped from 7 years earlier. 4 voices: Crew, Spencer Greer, Edwin Grail, and Northgate's previous CEO. The recording made clear that all 4 had known, within 72 hours of Hugh's termination, that the Clarity failure had not been fault. It made equally clear that none of them had considered doing anything about it. Hugh listened to the recording without moving. His hands were flat on the table. Blair listened to it and thought about what no income and no benefits means when someone you love becomes sick. And she thought about a girl whose drawings were folded above a sun visor, refolded many times, and she looked away from the screen because she needed a moment that was not about strategy. She apologized to Hugh and meant it, and he said quietly that an apology could not return a single day of the 7 years that silence had cost him. Crew offered her the clean path. The recording would disappear. Hugh would receive a private payment and a private acknowledgement. Northgate's financing would be extended. Everyone in the room would walk out, having lost nothing they couldn't recover. He presented it as mercy. Hugh said he would not allow the truth of what had happened to become a transaction between people with enough money to make inconvenient things disappear. Blair said she needed to make a call. She presented the Northgate Diagnostics Board with a restructuring proposal at 6:15 in the morning. Standing in the estate's front sitting room, with Hugh beside her, and Audrey Kells behind them, and the October light beginning to come in low through the east-facing windows. Spencer Greer was suspended before the call ended. 3 institutional investors Audrey Kells had quietly approached, through the estate's network confirmed they were prepared to commit capital. The moment Crew's financing was removed from the table, Maxwell Crew lost his controlling interest under a shareholder protection clause Northgate's founding documents had included, and that no one had ever expected to invoke. Clarity Core would be licensed to Northgate under the safety standards Hugh Merritt had established. A portion of every revenue stream the platform generated would go toward a fund for medical technology whistleblowers. A provision Blair had written into the framework herself. At 4 in the morning, while Hugh was on the phone with his daughter. She had overheard him through the half-open library door. He had kept his voice light and steady, the voice of a father making a promise across a distance he wasn't certain he could close. She had stood in the hallway and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with diagnostics, exactly who had been standing beside her for the past 12 hours. The full record of what had happened at Verdant Medical Systems 7 years earlier was made public in the weeks that followed. Hugh Merritt was formally cleared of every allegation, his original design work acknowledged in the permanent record of the technology he had built. Spencer Greer faced a regulatory investigation. Maxwell Crew resigned from the boards he sat on before the investigations required him to. The machinery of consequence moved without drama, the way it always does when the evidence is complete and the people holding it have decided not to let it be bought away. Hugh declined every offer of a corporate title or a senior role. He agreed to chair an independent technical review board overseeing Clarity Core's deployment, a position he could carry out from Clearwater, on a schedule that let him collect Lena from school every afternoon he wasn't on the road. He kept the maintenance business running because he'd built it himself, and because the people in the valley who relied on it were not any less important to him than they'd been before an estate lawyer had said his name in a courtyard full of people who hadn't known it. The Grail estate was converted into a training facility for medical systems engineers, carrying Hugh's name above the entrance in clean, unadorned lettering. The kind of recognition that doesn't require the person receiving it to become someone different. Blair drove out to Clearwater on a Thursday in March, her company stabilized and her board satisfied, and her rental car running without a single complaint. She pulled into the lot beside Hugh's workshop and sat for a moment before going in. She had brought the finalized partnership agreement in a folder on the passenger seat, though she could have sent it by courier. She hadn't sent it by courier. She thanked Hugh without ceremony, without the careful verbal architecture she used in boardrooms and press conferences, and he accepted it the same way, directly, without making a production of it. Before she left, she asked whether he might be willing to give her a ride sometime. The way she said it made clear that she wasn't talking about a ride. Hugh looked at her for a moment and said that depended on where she was headed. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and read him an address. It was the estate's new address, the research center, carrying his name above its doors. And it was the same address they had both been given once before by a man who had apparently understood, even at the end, that neither of them could get there alone. Hugh said he could be ready in 10 minutes. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without fuss, like he'd already decided it was the right thing to do. Blair leaned against the hood of her car in the March light and waited, and did not once check her watch.